In this lecture, we're going to discuss some of the common informal fallacies that are committed in everyday argumentation and everyday thinking, for that matter. Certainly, the ones I've selected to take a closer look at for our course, um, those aren't the only informal fallacies there are, but it's a nice selection of fallacies, um, and it's going to cover what we need. So, with no further ado, first, the purpose. This is dopey. I'm going to change this, but I can't stand that picture. But the purpose of what we're about to study here is so that you can not only learn how to spot these fallacies in the arguments of others, but also to learn how to avoid using them yourselves, right? So there's kind of a reflexive function of studying the fallacies. It's not just to see how other people do it, it's to also kind of refine your own thinking in that sense as well. Okay, now many of you have studied the informal fallacies, perhaps in an English course. So some of these may be familiar, and if they are not, we're starting from the ground up, so no worries there. But there are certain fallacies. So fallacies are problems in reasoning. Okay, and there are some, for our purposes, some fallacies, if they were present as a premise or support for a premise, they would affect the logical strength of the argument. In other words, they would weaken the argument. And there are some fallacies that, if they were present as a premise or support, would compromise the cogency of an argument. Now, when it comes to actually spotting these things in the arguments, that the bioethical arguments that we'll be looking at, we'll be doing this together. You won't be left out on your own, but these are important. It's important to understand the telltale signs of these fallacies, right? So the ones that would compromise strength and possibly lead to the argument being weak are known as against the person, appeal to the people, appeal to pity, hasty generalization, weak analogy, and unqualified authority. And then ones that, if they were present in an argument, might, as a premise, for instance, might compromise cogency, would be false dichotomy, false or questionable cause, and slippery slope. These might render a logically strong argument uncogent. So let's just take a look at let's just get the flavor profile of each of these fallacies. So against the person, also known as argumentum ad hominem in Latin. This is committed when a premise is used to cast doubt upon a person's argument by casting doubt upon his or her character and or circumstances, when those qualities are actually irrelevant to the conclusion of the argument. They're psychologically relevant, they're certainly persuasive, but logically they're irrelevant to the conclusion of the argument. Now, this fallacy comes in a few different flavors, known as abusive, circumstantial, and tu quoque, which just means you too, or like you hypocrite. But you don't need to really know these specifically. Just know against the person when you spot one. And let's try to spot one. Here's some textbook examples. So textbook examples are intended to simply to really carefully illustrate the fallacy. They're not necessarily intended to sound like the way that people speak out on the street or the way that you think to yourself, right? They're fully articulated examples of a fallacy. I mean, that's really what the nature of a textbook example is, right? So Jones has argued for a ban on government-sanctioned prayer at school events, but he's a rabid atheist without any discernible morals. Anything he has to say should be rejected outright. So the conclusion here is just forget about what Jones has to say, right? How come? Because he's a terrible atheist. Well, that's going against his character. This is essentially irrelevant to the conclusion. Or Mary says that we should oppose abortion, but you can't take her seriously. Her father is the pastor of a fundamentalist church. Here, rather than offering any support for why you can't take Mary's oppositional stance to abortion seriously, you're not offering any positive reasons in support of that conclusion. You're saying, well, look at her circumstances. Of course she's going to say that. Her dad's a pastor. Right? Again, irrelevant to the conclusion. And then here, these Hollywood liberals tell us that we should do everything we can to help the environment, but you simply must ignore them. Have you ever seen the gas guzzling machines that they have parked in front of their houses? This one is saying, don't believe what the Hollywood liberals tell us about helping the environment, because they are hypocrites, essentially. Right? Again, emotionally relevant, persuasive indeed, but logically, or emotionally relevant, I hope I just said, and emotionally persuasive, but logically irrelevant in all these cases. These are all examples, textbook examples of against the person. And then you can also see it in images. Right? I mean, we're going to be concerned with finding these in text and in writing, but you can see it done in advertising and politics and all sorts of circumstances like that. You can also present fallacious thinking in imagery and commercials and such. Like this, here, here, here. Okay, next up, appeal to the people, argumentum ad populum. So this fallacy is committed when premises describing the popularity of a product or belief are used to justify a conclusion that the product or belief has real merit, right? So really, popularity is logically irrelevant to real merit. Emotionally relevant, yes. Persuasive, yes. But logically irrelevant. Advertising agencies use this one very frequently. So some examples. You just have to get the new Taylor Swift album. Well, why? Well, because everyone's listening to it. It's at the top of the Billboard 100. So that's kind of like jump on the bandwagon, right? Why should I get the album? Because everybody's listening to it. Persuasive, but irrelevant to the conclusion. The few, the proud, the Marines. The implied conclusion being that you should join the Marines. Why? Because we're the few and we're the proud, right? This is an appeal to the people because it's appealing to maybe not the big, large group, but it's appealing to people who kind of want to separate themselves from that, right? And it's called vanity, but that doesn't really matter. All three of these are just, all you need to know is appeal to the people, right? In the second example, we're trying to appeal to those who want to distinguish themselves from the big group, but they want to include themselves in some group nonetheless. Or down here, living in Acme condominiums isn't for everyone, only for people of the most discriminating taste. Buy yours today. Sometimes that's just known as appeal to snobbery, but again, all these are just appeal to people. This is essentially saying, buy your Acme condominium. Why? Because only people of the most discriminating taste choose to live there. So you'll be separating yourselves from the masses by buying one of these condominiums, right? Persuasive, yes. Logically relevant, no. And here's some examples and images of the appeal to the people fallacy. Breakfast of champions, right? Over 99 billion served, so you should eat here. America runs on Dunkin', so you should eat here. America's favorite cereal, so you should get this cereal. Okay, next up, appeal to pity. And that's argumentum ad misericordiam, which in Latin means appeal to your merciful heart. Right? And this fallacy occurs when there's an attempt to inspire or evoke feelings of pity or sympathy in order to induce belief in a conclusion. Note, this is important too. Just because an argument may deal with a sad subject, it doesn't mean it's automatically an appeal to pity. A lot of arguments are about sad subjects. An appeal to pity is committed when you only offer like heartstring tuggers in order to get somebody to believe a conclusion. You resort to solicitation of pity only in support of your conclusion. So, some examples. Professor, it would be wrong for you to fail me for cheating. Well, how come you did cheat? Well, I'm out on my own here with no family to help me, and I have to work 3 jobs just to pay the bills, and at the end of the day, I'm so tired I have no energy left to study. Can this be persuasive? Sure. Is it sad and unfortunate that somebody is undergoing, experiencing this stuff? Yes, but irrelevant to the conclusion. Classic appeal to pity. Or down here, you should give me a strong recommendation for tenure and a promotion, because if I don't get these, I won't be able to pay my mortgage and my family, and I will be out on the streets and eating from dumpsters. Yes, indeed, this is all sad, and this could be persuasive. This could convince somebody to believe or accept or follow through with this conclusion, but these are irrelevant, logically irrelevant to the conclusion. Okay. Another like everyday example would be if you've ever gotten pulled over for a speeding ticket and you knew you were indeed speeding, but like, oh, please don't give me a ticket. I just broke up with my boyfriend and, and they're about to fire me from my job. And I lost my that kind of stuff. So, I mean, we're all kind of guilty. We're all guilty of all of these fallacies because we often do whatever we do and say whatever we have to get what we want. But when we're talking about logic and critical thinking, we've got a different set of standards for accepting a conclusion, and these just don't cut it. So here's a good example of this is back in like Prohibition days when people would essentially, this is essentially an argument against the re-election or against President Hoover at the time, and people would put their kids out there, right? So that you feel bad, and that makes you more inclined to accept the implied conclusion here, which is Hoover's no good as a president. Go back for a second. So I only put one image in here for appeal to pity because I didn't want to just bust out, because there's a lot of sad appeals to pity in imagery, right? So like the ASPCA with the abandoned animals and abused animals, sad, right? They are appeals to pity though. But like I said, just because something's, I don't want to sound cold about this kind of stuff, right? You certainly, don't want to, it's a valid and important thing to endeavor to attempt to get people to donate on behalf of a lot of these causes. But a lot of these charities are very guilty of simply supplying appeals to your merciful heart rather than good logical reasoning, right? But like, so the ASPCA does this. Feed the Children does this. But I figured you didn't need to see any of those images. You know what I'm talking about. Next up, hasty generalization. This fallacy is committed when a person generalizes from a sample that's too small or too unrepresentative to support the conclusion. So in worst case scenarios, it's simply called stereotyping. So some examples are like biased sampling, non-random sampling when we're talking about statistics. Here's a couple very simple examples. I know of 3 cases of people getting welfare payments while they have a good job of their own. People on welfare are just trying to get something for nothing. So here you're making a hasty generalization from a sample of 3 people that you know are getting fraudulent welfare payments, and then the conclusion jumps to all people on welfare are just trying to get something for nothing. Hasty generalization. Or down here, tens of thousands of Ford, Mercury, and GM owners polled were incredibly enthusiastic about their cars and very negative about imports. Americans prefer to buy American when it comes to their automobiles. So this being the conclusion down here, right? Hey, Americans prefer to buy American when it comes to their automobiles. Well, how do you know? Well, we polled tens of thousands. That's a lot of people. That's a large sample. Tens of thousands of Ford, Mercury, and GM owners were enthusiastic about their cars and negative about imports. So what's the problem here? Why am I using this as an example of hasty generalization? Because this was a bias sample. The number's good enough, tens of thousands, that's a big poll. But especially if you add, well, you couldn't add random. So take that back. The people that you polled, you skewed the poll. It's a biased sample. You started off with people who already owned, quote unquote, American cars. So it's more likely that they're going to skew this way, right? That would be considered a hasty generalization as well. Some examples. Those Asian American whiz kids, right? The implication is that all Asian American kids are whiz kids. Or this dude, Catholic clergy pedophile mafia, who is apparently out protesting the Catholic priest issue a few years back, and basically just lumps them all into this category: Catholic clergy pedophile mafia. So you have, in other words, an unfortunate sample of Catholic priests who were found guilty of, or were guilty of, pedophilia and molestation, and then this takes that and basically is implying that all of them are. Hasty generalization. This too, men's, women, so the hasty generalization being that men are just rad and active and ripping it, and women are just laying on the beach and sunning themselves and looking beautiful. Or, are you man enough to be a nurse? Right? The hasty generalization here is, it's multi-layered, but it's essentially that men believe that nursing is a feminine job. So it's kind of lumping all men in together and pitching it to those men. Are you man enough to be a nurse because all men think that nursing is a feminine job, for instance. Another hasty generalization, just coming through an image and a little bit of text. Next up, weak analogy. This fallacy occurs when our conclusion rests wholly or partly upon an analogy that's too loose and remote to support it. So remember that in logic, analogies must be as precise as possible. So in other words, the entities being compared have to share an adequate number of similarities that are relevant to the conclusion being drawn. This is essential. Here's some everyday examples. Bob's new car is blue, it has leather upholstery, and it gets great gas mileage. Mike's new car is blue and has leather upholstery. Therefore, it probably gets great gas mileage as well. Really, obviously, an obvious weak analogy, right? So you're trying to argue that Mike's new car probably gets great gas mileage. Well, how do you know? Well, Mike's car is blue and has leather upholstery just like Bob's. And Bob's gets great gas mileage. Well, the specific problem with this, again, you've probably already figured this out, is that those similarities between the two entities being compared, namely Bob's car and Mike's car, are not relevant to the conclusion. Blueness and leather upholsteriness have nothing to do with gas mileage, right? So weak analogy. Or bottom example. You wouldn't chastise a bartender for having a few drinks on the job. Therefore, you shouldn't chastise an airline pilot for having a few on a layover. Well, yes, this is an analogy, and yes, this is a weak analogy. And the reason it's weak is because the job of a bartender and the job of an airline pilot are too different to serve as a basis for comparison when we're talking about drinking on the job. Here's a few examples and images. I know this sounds like nitpicking, but it's just fun to look at images. And I mean, advertising would be nowhere without fallacies. Makes it fun. But we're doing logic and critical thinking. Like the real thing in the palm of your hand. So Nokia Express Music is just like holding a baby guitar in your hand. Or your baby sleeping with you can be just as dangerous. I think this is a public service announcement against sleeping with your infant, because I guess mothers can roll over and smother them, unfortunately. So this public service announcement is trying to say, you sleeping in bed with your baby, with your infant, is like you putting a weapon into bed with your infant. Now look, of course it gets the point across, and we don't have time to sit and read a complex standardized argument in order to get this message. Nobody would, it's a poster. This is what these agencies are supposed to do, right? So I'm not just, these aren't criticisms of these tactics when they're in these circumstances per se. It's just examples. This wouldn't pass in a logical situation, but of course it passes for a poster. It gets a message across. Or cigarettes are like women. The best ones are thin and rich. Silver thins are thin and rich. I don't even know if these are real cigarettes or not. I don't remember any silver thins, but nonetheless, obviously a weak analogy. Cigarettes are not like women. Okay, next up, unqualified authority. That's when we argue in favor of some conclusion and rely upon the testimony of some person or group that really has no legitimate claim to authority in the matter at hand, right? So just to refine this a bit, for an authority to be considered qualified, the following must obtain. You have to have expert X, let's imagine, has asserted a certain claim, P. And X is a reliable and credible person in this context. and P, or the claim that's being made by expert X, falls within area of specialization, let's say K. K is a genuine area of knowledge, and X is an expert or authority in K, that genuine area of knowledge. Let's get some examples here. You should buy CoverGirl cosmetics. Well, why? Because Demi Lovato says they're good and she has delicate skin like you do. So here, Demi Lovato is being used as ostensibly the authority in the matter. Why should I get these? Because she says so, right? And the problem is that Demi Lovato is not a, let's say, a dermatologist, for instance. If you're going to use arguments by authority, you have to pick the right authority, and that authority has to meet these conditions. Or down here, we must embrace universal health care. Well, how come? Because Michael Moore has researched the issue thoroughly, made a documentary about it, and completely endorses it. Well, that's fine, and Michael Moore might do his homework. Perhaps and yes, he's made a documentary about that and many other issues, and he completely endorses it. And the documentary is extremely persuasive and like I said, possibly well-researched. But the issue here is that you've got a conclusion, and then you are offering up an argument by authority, and you're just not choosing the right authority. Right? In this case, a more proper authority would be a physician, an economist, a physician/economist, somebody. But so the point is, it's not necessarily that Michael Moore cannot have expertise in this subject. The point is that when you're crafting an argument and you're using an argument, a premise that cites an authority to support your conclusion, you got to choose the right one or the appropriate one. So advertising finds itself guilty of this, but of course, right? Product endorsement, buy a Nikon, pretty much why? Because Ashton Kutcher says so. Or I like the old-fashioned advertisements. Buy luster cream, lotion, shampoo. Why? Because Marilyn Monroe says you should and she uses it. Another old-fashioned one that's awesome. Smoke Camels. How come? Because doctors say you should. Or smoke Viceroys. Why? Because your dentist recommends it. Them. Or buy this Canon camera. Why? Because I don't even know who this is. This tennis player says you should. Maria Sharapova, is that her name? Okay. Those were the fallacies that, if present in an argument as a premise, would compromise the logical strength of the argument. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the few fallacies that, if present, would compromise the cogency or of the argument. They would pose a problem for the acceptability of the premises, which means that if you're going to spot these, the argument will have already passed the strength test. Because once again, a strong argument can be cogent or uncogent. If the argument is weak, it's automatically uncogent. So these would be problems with the argument that might pass when you're doing the strength test, but you'd pick them up when it comes to the cogency aspect of the test. Let's take a look. First, false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is a statement of the type, it's either X or Y, where the two alternatives, namely X and Y, don't exhaust the possibilities, but they're presented like they do. So this is also known as black and white thinking, and it's one of the most dangerous and prolific fallacies out there. It's pervasive in our thinking. It's hard to get rid of. It's pervasive in advertising. It's pervasive in politics. It's pervasive everywhere. It's a really important fallacy to be conscious of. So here's some examples. Either you donate to the American Cancer Foundation or you don't care about finding a cure for it. The choice should be obvious, right? Either donate or that means you don't care. Either X or Y, when that's not really true. Notice we're talking about truth or acceptability. That's why this is a problem with cogency. It's not true that either you give or you don't care. You could fall somewhere in the middle, for instance, or maybe you gave at the office, so you're not going to give to this person, right? Or America, love it or leave it. Is it the case that either you love it or you have to leave it, right? Can't you love it and leave it? Can't you leave it but still and not love it? You understand what I'm saying. If you love it, does that automatically mean that you don't have to leave it? I mean, you can unpack this a bunch of ways, but it's not simply either love it or leave it. You can, I don't know, hate it and stay. Again, many other possibilities. The dichotomy is false. The X or Y is false. Or you're either with us or against us. You're either X or Y. And it's just not that simple. I could be with you without being entirely against you, right? You're being offered a false choice, a black and white choice, when in reality the choice is much more complicated. In other words, a false dichotomy. Examples. This is a bulletin board in the UK. He needs bulletproof vests, not an alternative voting system. Right? So apparently they had some referendum up about whether or not they should have an alternative voting system, and whoever put this billboard up, I guess it's No to AV, said, look, you got a choice. Either fund this alternative voting system or fund bulletproof vests, but you can't have both, right? And certainly you can have both. You have to make decisions. But see how persuasive that can be? Like, if you choose this system, then you're denying this person bulletproof vests, which then means you are unpatriotic, right? Or your hands are only as clean as the towel used to dry them. So buy these Kleenex disposable hand towels. Why? Because when you use these Kleenex disposable hand towels, you have this really clean, newer bathroom, clean towel, clean wall, everything. But if you're not using them, it's like this dank, nasty towel, old school, right? So either use our stuff or you're using this. Of course, you could just wash your towel, right? False dichotomy. Very effective in advertising. You can choose to feel sore tomorrow or sorry tomorrow. You choose. Well, that's not the only two choices, right? Or who would you rather see live? This is for an organization that that promotes animal research, that defends research on animals. And this is a very clever poster, as a matter of fact. Who would you rather see live? Her or the rat? Right? And I mean, this, like I said, this is clever. The false dichotomy is spelled out in many ways, right? So either you keep funding research or you'd rather see this rat live. Or if you are against animal research, then she's going to die, right? And here you've got the rat and the her and the white and the pink. So you have to choose. Either you save the lives of these research animals or you save the lives of children, when really it's not that simple, but very clever billboard. False or questionable cause. That's when we draw a conclusion based upon some imagined causal connection that probably doesn't exist, or attribute a single cause to a thing or event when most likely there's more than one, and perhaps many. These are some different forms of false cause, right? Different flavors, but they're all false cause. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore because of this. Non causa pro causa means not the cause, for the cause. And oversimplification. Let's look at some examples. After Florida relaxed its concealed weapons law, the crime rate dropped. Clearly allowing people to carry concealed weapons results in a reduction of crime. So here you've got the conclusion, right? Allowing people to carry concealed weapons will reduce crime. Well, how do you know? Because right after Florida relaxed its concealed weapons law, crime rate dropped. So Florida did this, crime rate dropped, right? After this, therefore, because of this. Now, that could be the case. There could be a causal connection between these two, but this argument doesn't take the time or bother to unpack that causal relation. Excuse me. So you could call this false cause or questionable cause. There are more churches in New York City than in any other city in the nation, and more crimes are committed in New York City than anywhere else. Clearly, if we want to eliminate crime, we must abolish the churches. So here, this is saying, look, on a timeline, in New York, we've got more crime, highest crime rate, and highest church rate. And these are coincidental, right? So there must be a causal relationship between the two. And perhaps there is, but unless the argument spells that out carefully, you can accuse it of the fallacy of false or questionable cause. And then down here, they got divorced because they married too young. It's just that simple. So this is saying, look, married too young caused divorce, when in reality, it's never that simple. There are probably a multitude of contributing causes that went into generating the effect of the divorce, but in this argument, somebody has chosen one because it suits their purposes most likely to explain the divorce. And you can call this out for a false or questionable cause as well. Some examples: just add vodka. Everything's boring and suburban. Add a little vodka and it's poppin'. Very cute ad. Very effective ad. But from a logical standpoint, vodka does not cause the suburbs to just come alive like that. If anything, forget it. All right, next. Cheat death. Right? So in other words, drinking Palm Wonderful causes immortality. Or, I am Alicia Silverstone and I'm a vegetarian. Right? So here's the implied causal connection is that being a vegetarian will cause you to look like Alicia Silverstone. Silverstone. And again, I'm not trying to be nitpicky here. We're looking at these things from a logical perspective. When you take the logic glasses off, it's just effective advertising, right? But we aren't we're not in an advertising course, we're in a logic course, and these are committing like logical crimes, essentially. Or it's all Bush's fault. No matter what it is, it's Bush's fault. Oversimplification, false cause. Okay, and last step. Slippery slope is an extended causal argument gone rogue, right? And that's when our conclusion rests upon the claim that a certain event will set off a causal chain of events, leading in the end to some undesirable consequence. But there's no real sufficient reason to think that the causal chain will ever take place, right? Here's an example. Dog owners have asked that they be allowed to bring their pets to the beach. This request should be denied. If dogs are allowed on the beach, then soon we will have horses and cows, and before long it'll be sheep and goats and chickens, and all of that potential prey will attract jaguars and lions and tigers. The beach will become a war zone. Or, once you allow voluntary euthanasia, there'll be pressure for assisted voluntary euthanasia. Once this is established, involuntary euthanasia will follow for patients who have incurable diseases but are comatose and cannot make their own decisions. The procedures that permit involuntary euthanasia for those with incurable diseases bring about euthanasia. I'm sure you can pick up the rhythm of this, right? Don't do this. Because if you do this, it'll cause this and it'll cause that and eventually lead to some terribly undesirable set of circumstances. If you're wondering what I'm drawing here, that's supposed to be a skull and crossbones. Embarrassing. And many of you are familiar with this commercial, which was very cute. When your cable company puts you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you go blow off steam. When you go blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, people want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up in a roadside ditch. You don't want to wake up in a roadside ditch. Get rid of cable. Very cute. And actually, this commercial is a very self-aware commercial. They're aware of how well slippery slope reasoning works on people. So they're it's tongue in cheek. They're mocking the slippery slope as an advertising gimmick by making it sound so ridiculous, but they're still smuggling it in there nonetheless, right? Very clever. Okay, I know that was longer than usual, but we handled it. We just took a look at the fallacies that would affect strength and the ones that would affect cogency.